And we'll now go on with your confrere, Tim de Muzio, from Australia, with a big pot of coffee in front of him. He's Associate Professor of International Relations and Political Economy at the School of Humanities and Social Inquiry at the University of Wollongong, Australia. I already showed the books that you co-wrote with Dr. Robbins, but I'm in the middle now myself in reading your Carbon Capitalism, Energy, Social Reproduction, and World Order. And actually the statement that I developed for, to lob at Glasgow has a quote there where you talk about, we got a pre-carbon age, a carbon age, and then a post-carbon age. And it's simple, but it's very profound at the same time. I have not much further to add to that, except then that the title of your presentation is MMT, the Pandemic and Fiscal Fright. Tim, good to see you. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Govert. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to talk with everyone. And greetings from a very rainy Sydney and early Sunday morning. And I just want to say thanks to Richard for his talk. I really enjoyed that as well. You'll notice some sort of similarities. This talk is a bit of a strange beast for me because whilst Richard and I have dealt with MMT before, I wouldn't say we had a kind of a significant engagement with it because I think we were far more critical than what MMT was. But in preparing this chapter for an edited collection that I'm doing now, I thought I'd kind of engage its critics, and then see, how we can move kind of beyond it. So that's kind of the nature of this talk. I'm going to share my screen if I can, and we'll run through this presentation on MMT, the pandemic, and fiscal fright. So let's just make sure. Can everyone see the slides?
Yes, they're not in slideshow mode yet.
I'm not. Okay. Is that better?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah. Okay. So basically the argument for this whole talk, we kind of want to, put it in a nutshell, is that current fiscal and monetary arrangements, seemingly cast in stone due to decisions made by politicians and financiers in the distant past, need to be repoliticized and rethought for challenges of the 21st century. And I think this conference and the whole kind of shtick of AMI is about this anyhow. But this is kind of the, if you want to be, the new Facebook meta kind of argument that I'm trying to make. So the agenda is fairly simple. I'm going to talk to you about the incitement for this talk and why I wrote what I wrote. We'll go over MMT in short, which I'm sure most are familiar with. I'm going to look at some mainstream critics of MMT, and then I'm going to show you why they're wrong. So that's kind of in support of MMT's argument. And MMT scholars are generally not very good at doing this. I'm not sure why, but I've got a number of charts that I've done just to show how wrong the critics are. And then what I want to do is give you kind of the critical view of MMT, which I'm sure a number of you are already completely familiar with. So this, again, is a bit of a strange beast in the sense that I wouldn't normally engage MMT in kind of a deep and meaningful way, but I did so in this case. And you'll see why on the next slide, which is the pandemic. And the pandemic obviously gives rise to this renewed firepower of fiscal policy, right? Monetary policy in no way, shape, or form during the pandemic. You can't lower interest rates, into a negative zone to, get people to spend and so on and so forth on the level that we needed during the pandemic. So fiscal policy becomes this massive kind of armory in the hands of our governments. And even by, I think it was April, the Financial Times, April 2020, Financial Times is writing, this is the biggest borrowing spree in history, right? This is a huge extravagance. And they wrote this even before the party got started. That is to say, before even more trillions are spent by advanced capitalist economies, or I should say advanced capitalist governments, spending into the economy through their fiscal policy. Now, remember the context for this. Before this, almost every, Treasury Secretary is basically preaching the gospel of fiscal discipline, right? Balanced budgets. And so this seems completely at odds, right? With no matter what kind of political party, whether in power or not, completely at odds with the kind of neoliberal general idea of how we should run an economy, right? So all of a sudden, balanced budgets, fiscal discipline goes out the window. We need to spend money. How do we do that? Well, we know that the government can actually spend money into the economy, and we can talk about how it does that. But nonetheless, all of a sudden, we start to see in the mainstream press discussion of MMT, right? So this little group has been around for quite a while. It's modern monetary theory. It's essentially what I would call neo-Keynesian, or old wine in new bottles. It's formulated in a slightly different way than maybe Keynes and Keynes's acolytes might have suggested after World War II, or even slightly before. But nonetheless, all of a sudden, The Economist, the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, among other myriad publications, start discussing this, because no one knows what's kind of going on at this point, right? Like, how do we deal with an economy on lockdown, shutdown, rising unemployment, and so on and so forth? And technically, it's nobody's fault. It's this, biocapitalist disease that, is wrecking the normal run of things, or the normal run of the economy. The other thing that I think really got me interested in engaging with this is Stephanie Kelton obviously writes this book, The Deficit Myth, and it comes pretty much in the middle of 2020, after COVID is spreading around the world and governments are starting to spend. And so that makes MMT something on a more mainstream international agenda, and everyone seemed to kind of want to talk about it. So that's kind of the incitement for why I kind of wanted to interject myself and my own thinking, and by extension, Richard, who I don't want to implicate per se, but my own thinking into this debate. So that's the incitement. Let's just take a look at some of the empirical details that have happened during COVID. So this here is a chart of M2. Many of you would probably be familiar with it. It's a common measure of money and its expansion over time. And we can see that from March 2020, we had about $16 trillion in M2, and that increases to 21 trillion over the course of the pandemic. So 24% of the money supply created, was created during the pandemic. Now, I'm not panicked about that at all, and I think there's very good reason not to be panicked about it. But people, more or less, who are on the right of the political spectrum are very concerned with this, right? So they see this and they go, this is crazy. There's too much money now in the economy, and we're going to see hyperinflation like we've never seen. We're going to be Weimar Germany within the next couple of months, okay? I don't fear that whatsoever. I'll give you some reasons why later. But nonetheless, this is, why we see the panic button being pushed. The next chart just shows you kind of the opposite of that. The increase of M2 obviously is one thing, and the other thing is obviously the increase in the federal deficit. So in the fiscal year 2020, we don't have the numbers yet for 2021, but in 2020, it was 3.1 trillion, right? So you can see this massive spike downward. And again, this has a lot of people very, very worried. And if we're paying attention to the financial press, we know that this is a topic of debate pretty much every day, right? So that's just kind of to set it out from a bird's eye point of view, and to get our ideas straight insofar as how some of the mainstream economists are thinking about this, because they see this, they see red, they want to push the panic button. Don't think there's a big reason to do that. And again, hopefully that will become clear in just a moment. So most of us probably are very familiar with MMT. So here's kind of the bullet points. I've kind of tried to boil it down to 5 major points that MMT tries to make. But the big one is essentially national governments who are currency issuers, and they make a big distinction between those who issue the currency and those who are currency users. As long as the government is a currency issuer, it always has the ability to service its debts, provided, of course, that those debts are in the national currency. I won't go through these other points because, again, most of us would be familiar with MMT and what they're saying. And I think the big point is the following. MMT does not quarrel with the current way government finances are set up, but it rather seeks to show politicians and the public that running deficits can be beneficial for human well-being and the economy if government is monetarily sovereign. And this is why we get a lot of mainstream debate on MMT, because they're saying, in a nutshell, you don't have to worry about government deficits. And I think they're right. Would I go beyond them and try and challenge the fiscal monetary system and have something like a sovereign monetary system? Yes. But here, what I'm trying to do is just engage them and then look at who is criticizing them and how are they almost raising things in the debate to a level of, fear mongering. And so I thought, well, the people in the debate who advocate for MMT, like Stephanie Kelton, Bill Mitchell, and others, they're not really looking at the empirical detail to kind of test this theory that arguably deficits don't matter. I'm not saying that they don't necessarily, but I'm saying, okay, at least they're not worried, right? And there's something to that argument if you stay within current fiscal monetary arrangements. So I thought, all right, well, let's have a look at the critics and what they're saying and see if I can refute what they're saying. Okay, so we have the critics of MMT, and sometimes in depends on what report you're reading or article, but I like this quote. I think it's from two very conservative Americans who called MMT an extreme school of thought, right? Well, wait till they hear about sovereign money or any other kind of major monetary reform proposal, right? MMT is kind of light on this, and most of you know this. So the two main arguments against MMT from the mainstream is, okay, first is the fear of inflation, right? So MMT is criticized for being too much demand side focused. They don't really care about supply constraint. They're not really looking at that. There could potentially be runaway inflation if the government spends too much money into the economy. And then lo and behold, if we spend too much money into the economy, we have too much debt. Eventually, we're going to have to raise taxes to pay or at least service this debt, right? Okay, fair enough. In contemporary kind of economic thinking, we would potentially anticipate that there would be runaway inflation if the government spends too much money in the economy. What that number is, no one knows. And this is kind of what these guys fear, right? That we don't necessarily know how much a government can go into deficit to spend into the economy before we see inflation. So that's one of their big critiques. The second one is we've got the old bugbear of the crowding out phenomenon, which basically this critique is born with the birth of political economy. The first kind of tenet of it is that government borrowing can increase interest rates, making it more expensive for businesses to borrow and grow, right? So we crowd out, the private industry because government is taking all the money or borrowing all the money, therefore increasing interest rates. So this is an idiotic idea that there is almost like, it's almost like we're back on the gold standard in the sense of that there's one little pot of money. And if the government starts to take from that pot, there's less for everybody else. Well, that's bullshit. But nonetheless, this is, kind of commonplace thinking in economics or mainstream or neoclassical economics. Second is people will anticipate that they're going to have to pay higher taxes in the future because we're borrowing too much. And therefore, what they do instead of spending into the economy, they save. And we'll see actually that the savings rate did increase under COVID. And I think that makes sense. So I don't think this is a way to critique MMT. And in fact, a few papers have been written recently that question this very idea that people save because they anticipate higher taxes in the future. People save for all kinds of different reasons, not necessarily because they believe they'll be taxed higher in future. And then the next is high interest rates. So interest rates are going up because the government is taking from this small amount of money that or small pool of money that's available. Interest rates are going to start to skyrocket. and then that will attract foreign investors. And the foreign investors will come in, want to buy government treasuries because the interest rates are escalating, and this will lead to a demand for the currency and therefore currency appreciation. And this is really bad for our exporters in the United States or any other country, right, who's experiencing this. So that's kind of the main critiques. I know I'm kind of building a caricature of them on some level for the purpose of this talk, but this in essence, I think, is their critiques of MMT. Okay, so then the next logical step is, does this really hold water, right? Well, let's look at the empirical details, which almost no one is doing. So I've just read a number of things. One of my friends called Paul Sherd, who's at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, just wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal, and there's a whole series of kind of comments on this, again, about inflation and what to expect. And everyone is really, really fearful, but no one's really looking at the detail. So the next slide I have is just from yesterday, and this is Paul Sherd's commentary. He makes comments on this article, which is called "The Monetary Bathtub is Overflowing." So again, this massive fear, the Fed and the government combined have put too much money in the economy, and we're really screwed. We're going to see inflation go off the charts, right? Again, remember, because of deficit spending, that's the trigger, right? So when we think, what I'm arguing here is that they think, the critics think, that too much government spending is going to lead to runaway / hyperinflation. And I'm going to show you, I think this is absolute bullshit. And let's get into the empirical detail. So I made this chart when I was writing the chapter, and as you can see, on the right scale, we have the rate of inflation monitored by the Fed, and then we have deficits in the red bars. Now, it's completely telling that in the era of very high deficits, so let's move from 2010 to, of course, the level of spending during the pandemic, which is very, very high. We still have an average inflation rate of about 2% over a 20-year period, right? So never mind exactly the pandemic, but let's just look at, at the new millennium and what's gone on, and then compare that to very small budget deficits throughout the 80s and 90s. And obviously we have the Clinton surpluses in about the mid 1990s. If you look at the average inflation rate from 1960 to 2000, that's 4.5%, right? So what that suggests to us is two kind of funny things, right? There's either kind of no relationship between the inflation rate and deficit spending. And if there is a relationship, the more we actually spend into the economy, the more the government goes into deficits, the lower the interest rates will be, right? Now, granted, this is only, a chart from 1960 to 2020, but it gets rid of this idea that deficits are the primary cause of inflation, or at least I think it seriously challenges that view. On the next chart, we have federal funds rate and deficits. And so remember this idea: if government is borrowing, the interest rates are going to go off the charts, right? And then we're going to crowd out private businesses who want to borrow to expand their businesses and hire workers and so on and so forth. Well, again, history doesn't history doesn't justify this. The statistics, the empirical detail doesn't justify this. So in fact, we have the highest interest rates ever, and most of you will be familiar with this, the Volcker shocks of 79, 80, 81, during this period when we have relatively low deficits, right? And then from there, interest rates, kind of snake around a little bit, but they're on a complete decline. And by the time we have massive budget deficits in the United States of America, they are basically collapsing almost virtually to zero, right? And so the idea that the government deficits and borrowing and taking from this small pool of money, which again is bullshit, this argument doesn't hold water empirically whatsoever. And in fact, it would show the exact opposite of what the kind of neoliberals or conservatives are saying, right? Now, this might be an exceptional circumstance. And again, our data only goes from 1960 to 2020. So who knows what it might look like in 2050, but the data suggests that, even though we have very, very high deficits during this period, we have quite low interest rates. And in fact, not only quite low interest rates, but low interest rates historically. So one of the questions is, why, I guess, and we can debate that. But nonetheless, I'm trying to help our friends at MMT out and debunk some of the critics by looking at the empirical detail. So the thing that I would suggest to us is that, well, raising interest rates cannot kill inflation. I don't think it will ever kill inflation. It's the wrong kind of tool. It will only contribute to it. So why? Well, interest is a cost of business and will be pushed onto consumers due to capitalist cost plus accounting. So as we know, most capitalists, a capitalist enterprise, capitalist firm, it's run for profit. They figure out all their costs for a good or a service that they provide, and then they add a markup. And usually the markup's conventional. So for example, if you're in the restaurant industry, you know that it's convention that you add 30% onto the price of a meal. So you figure out the cost of, say, I don't know, your chicken Parmesan, and it's say $4 all in with labor and energy and everything that you've had to pay to get that on a plate to a consumer, and then you add 30% on top of it, right? For alcohol, it's 100%, right, in a restaurant. So, that bottle of wine that you buy in the shop, that might cost $30, it's going to be $60 at the restaurant, right? In general. So the idea, hopefully, is pretty clear, and most would know this, especially if anyone's run a business for profit. Okay, so keeping on with this idea that interest rates will only increase inflation rather than decrease it, businesses push the cost of interest onto their consumers, but also, and if you look at it, and I'll show you in just a sec, households actually and businesses continue to borrow even when the interest rate is high. And I think that's kind of the nature of the need for credit money in our economies, because there's not enough purchasing power in our economies to actually clear the goods and services we produce. And I'll show you that in just a second. So again, raising interest rates, if anyone ever says that to you, will kill inflation. The only time that it will kill inflation, if it's the case that too much money is chasing too few goods. So that we're in a situation where we're not productive, we don't have enough goods and services, and we're just printing money. And sure, we're going to have inflation or hyperinflation, and maybe high interest rates will kill it, at that point. But we're not in that situation in any way, shape, or form in the United States, in Australia, and so on. So I'm very wary about this idea that monetary policy we should increase interest rates to quell inflation. I think that's completely wrong. You have to look at where the source of inflation is coming from, and that is differential. That is to say, it's not by too much money chasing too few goods in most instances. And as we know, if you've been reading the press, generally it does come from some supply constraints or the increase in the cost of shipping, and lately, obviously, the increase in the price of a barrel of oil, which we know our economy is completely run on. Okay, so I wanted to show everyone the correlation between these two charts. I wasn't able in time because I've been marking over the last 2 weeks to actually show them together. But let's just take a good look at this chart. This is the federal funds rate, okay? We see the Volcker shocks here in 79 and the 80s, right? Huge increase in interest rates. And we've seen this come down over time where the base rate is near or close to zero, okay? So just keep your eye on that. And I wish I would have had time to correlate the two. I'll probably do this next week when I'm finished my marking. Keep your eye on that and look at the structure of it. Now look at the next chart. That's your inflation rate. It mirrors very close, just visually, I can see it. It mirrors very, very close to the federal funds rate. And again, I think this suggests that if you increase interest rates, you're only going to increase consumer prices because businesses will pass the the interest that they're going to pay on loans off to consumers. It's a cost of doing business, right? So again, don't have the exact chart to show both in tandem, but I think you can see there's very clear similarities between interest rates and inflation. Okay. And this is just to show us non-financial corporate debt. So these are loans that corporations take out that are non-financial. So think Walmart or Bed Bath & Beyond or whatever it might be. And this is just to show us that even during the period of high interest rates, again, which is 79, 80, 81, businesses continue to borrow, right? And they have to, right, to expand their production. And they're not, as we know, money creators, right? So they're reliant themselves on loans from banks. Okay, let's move on. So this is just to show us basically the savings argument, right? So what we see here is a series from 2000 of government deficits, and the savings rate is pretty much hovering around 4.5%. And then of course you get this massive saving during the pandemic, which of course the crowding out people will suggest to us that, yep, see what's happening here is that government has spent too much money into the economy. People anticipate that we're going to get taxed in the future, and so they're saving. Well, we can have this debate, and I'm happy to have these questions, but again, in this debate, people are very, very confused. There is no empirical evidence that definitively suggests that people save money because they fear future taxes, right? People obviously save money during this period, I would argue to you, again, it being very exceptional because, you know, we were locked down. You couldn't spend a lot of money. And despite the fact that you may have had an internet connection and wanted to, you know, go online shopping, there's only a limit, you know, to what you can kind of do in the same way as what you might do out on the street, go to a restaurant, get a coffee, da, 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 right? Anyhow, we can have that debate, but this is just to show you savings rate versus deficits. Okay, so I've helped my little friends at MMT out here, I think. This is just to show us the savings rate over time. So you see, obviously, there's the spike in March when the pandemic hits, and then it starts to decline over time. And then there's a few little other spikes before declining again as we kind of come out of lockdown, right? So savings rate is lessening over time as we become arguably freer, allowed to roam around, spend how we might want to. Okay. So what's the upshot? I think there is virtually zero evidence to suggest that federal deficits, even large deficits, especially in times of severe crisis like the pandemic, promote inflation. I think this is a bugbear, and while we can engage in that debate, I think if you don't look at the empirical detail, and most don't, you'll end up in confusion. And I want to avoid us getting into confusion because I've been in the war against confusion for a very long time. So of course, this doesn't stop people from worrying about quote unquote printing money, which I hate when I hear this phrase. Most of our money is digital. The Fed is not quote unquote printing money in the sense of the trillions. These are all balance sheet operations. The money's already digital, and it's just their accounting identities that we should be concerned with between what the Treasury is doing and what the Fed is doing, right? And Paul Sherd, again, I've referenced before, who wrote that opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal and who's at the Kennedy School of Government or Business or something like that at Harvard, wrote a wonderful article when he was working at Standard & Poor's on this in 2013. And I think Govert might have it, and maybe it's shared somewhere on some internet website. But I'm happy to share it because it's really, really good for understanding the balance sheet operations of what's going on between the Fed and the government. Okay, so the idea that inflation is too much money chasing too few goods is a near religious belief. And it dawned on me, you know, I was a big fan of Michel Foucault's Society Must Be Defended. And Foucault said, all right, well, we know Clausewitz's old aphorism, which is war is politics by other means, right? And Foucault said, well, historically, what if we rethink that and politics is war by other means? So he completely inverses this very famous phrase by Clausewitz. And we know that in modern economics, whenever we talk of inflation, we hear this, well, there's too much money chasing too few goods. And to borrow from Foucault, I'm going to suggest to you, what if it's actually the inverse? What if there's too little money chasing too many goods? And that's actually our problem rather than the former. Okay, so that might sound a bit crazy to some of us, but this is my critique of MMT. They have no theoretical or deep empirical understanding of the problem of aggregate demand. They know it exists, but they can't tell us why, right? So why does the government have to go into deficit? Well, to provide all those good things for people that create a better society, whether it's tackling climate change or giving people a job. So one of their big, postulates is a guaranteed job. So if you can't get one in the private sphere, the government will provide you with X amount of income to do work within your local community that's of value to the community. Great policy, right? I don't think many people, well, people do get up in arms about that, but nonetheless, if you're kind of on the left of the spectrum or progressive, I guess, you would think this is a good policy. If people want work and we live in a monetary economy, they need money to spend in the economy, of course, we should give them work. And there's lots of things that they can do that would add value to their communities. Anyhow, so they don't have this understanding, deep understanding, empirical understanding of where the aggregate demand problem happens in capitalism. And Richard and I have written about this before, and it's in the accounting. It's in the way that the system is actually set up. You're never going to get to a situation where there's enough purchasing power in the economy that will clear all the goods and services that are produced in any one year. And I'll show you that in just a second. This actually goes back as well to the work of C.H. Douglas, who was writing on social credit. I can talk a little bit more about him another time if we want to do something on C.H. Douglas, but I have to kind of credit him for recognizing this in the beginning. And Richard and I had just put on kind of empirical flesh on the bones of what C.H. Douglas had presented. And then there's, of course, in MMT, most of you would know this, there's virtually no kind of critique of how commercial banks create the majority of the money supply. And most of us would not be surprised to know that the majority of our money supply is actually through lending for mortgages. It's very rife in the United States, as we'll see, and it's certainly rife here in Australia. So about 72% of our money supply in Australia is actually issued as debt when people take out loans for mortgages. Okay, so these are my two kind of critical issues with MMT. I tried to help them empirically and said, yeah, okay, well, there's evidence to suggest we shouldn't be concerned with deficits, but we need to move beyond this fiscal monetary system. So let's consider the problem of aggregate demand. And then, and I'm wrapping up pretty soon, and then think about how commercial banks issue new currency, or most of our new currency. And I've written already, and with Richard and separately, how we might critique that. So I won't get into that here, but nonetheless, if we have questions about it, I'm more than happy to address it. Okay, so here's the gap, right? So all I've done here, and Richard and I have done this together, is we decided to chart all wages and salaries in the United States from 1965 to the latest data at that time was 2017. So we should update that. But nonetheless, we have all wages and salaries, and this is the blue line in the graph, and then real GDP. And GDP is obviously a monetary calculation of the transactions within an economy throughout one given year, right? So there's a massive gap between the goods and services that are produced in the economy and the wages and salaries that are paid. So what fills this massive gap? Well, if you've paid attention to Richard's presentation only minutes ago, it's debt. It's people taking out credit cards, car loans, personal loans, so on and so forth, right? And obviously it does have to do with international transactions, that is to say, people buying things from abroad, right? But the point is, the aggregate demand problem comes from the accounting of, well, the cost plus accounting of capitalism. And I have a little example under lockdown here. I started making margarita mix because I just wanted to know how to do it. And I thought, well, this can't be that tricky, and it costs $30 a bottle in the store. So I started doing this. And so I have this joke company called Uncle Pepe's Super Happy Fun Margarita Mix. And that's the next example here. So imagine you're a capitalist enterprise. You're going to do exactly what I said earlier. You're going to figure out the cost of goods. So here we have, you're going to have to buy sugar, lemon, lime juice, gas for the stove, bottles and caps, whatever. So I can figure out that to produce one bottle, say 1 liter, right, it's going to cost me $3.12. So what am I going to do? I'm obviously not going to sell it for $3.12. Otherwise, I'm working for nothing, right? So if I want to make a profit, I'm going to do a markup. And I just decided here, the markup will be $6.88, right? So that gives me a nice even $10 per bottle that I can charge people if I want to sell my super happy fun margarita mix. And we can see here that the only thing that's highlighted in yellow is the labor. So if I hire laborers to do this, I've put $100 of purchasing power into the economy, right? But look at the total market value of the margarita mix outstanding. That would be 1,000 for this run of production, right? So there's not enough purchasing power in the system to clear the goods and services produced. And you can run that throughout the whole economy. If you kind of extrapolate this kind of accounting system throughout every productive firm in the United States of America or anywhere else, and you're only going to create limited purchasing power. And again, go back to this. So that's the accounting of it in a very simple way. And we can see here that this is actually true in an empirical sense from wage and salary disbursements versus GDP. Okay, so again, a critique of MMT, they have no real idea where the aggregate demand problem is coming from. So basically, what I wanted to move to next is to say, there's almost very little discussion. I'm not saying MMT as a whole doesn't know about commercial bank lending, but they certainly don't seem to suggest that this is problematic in any way, shape, or form. And again, I've critiqued this before with Richard and separately, but nonetheless, this is obviously what we should be doing and should be discussing, and that's what we are discussing during this conference. So this is just to show us mortgage debt in the United States of America, because it's very important for us to understand that a lot of the money, in fact, the majority of the money in our economies is being issued as debt, which we know, but is being issued as debt for mortgages. So this is mortgage debt in the United States up to 2019 when the series was discontinued. And that's 21.4 trillion. And if you look at the comparison of that with M2, that's 76% of GDP is generated by mortgage debt in the United States of America. Okay, so the conclusion, and thank you for bearing with me. MMT, I would argue, is essentially old Keynesian wine in new bottles. I think it's useful up to a point, and mainstream critics, I think, as I've shown, and we can debate this, maybe I got something wrong, they're largely wrong about deficit spending. And I think ultimately, and this is what we're doing at this conference, is we need to really re-politicize fiscal monetary relations for the challenges of the 21st century. And of course, as you know, there's a plethora of challenges to deal with. So I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for your company, and hopefully we can have a really nice conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. That's great. Get some empirical evidence to the MMT debate. That's very much appreciated. I have questions, but I'm going straight to those who have raised their hands. And I got first Franz, then Joe, and then Kevin. And maybe we can shoe in Jeff, but we'll see about time. Though this is the end of today, so we have some leeway. And so my boss will decide when the cutoff will be, and then we'll have a song by Howard again to lighten the day up. But first, Franz, you're there, sitting, comfortable to get your question going. And unmute, please.
Yeah, my question basically was to Richard's presentation about debt strike. And this, I have to remove this.
Yeah. Can you keep it short, the question? And I have to see if, and I think Dr. Robbins is still here to possibly answer it, but keep it short, Franz.
Yeah, so when we talk about debt strike, we can also basically indicate where we want things to go. And so I'm focusing on debt in Africa. And people were all the time talking about reparation. And I said, no, not only reparation, but basically transformation. And so needed is the transformation of the international monetary system that would, and particularly in these times of climate, would be a decarbonization monetary system, and also with a money-based fiscal system, and I'm getting tired.
Frans, you want Africa to do a debt strike?
Yeah, so what I was proposing in that particular context of doing a partial debt strike, and would consist of about simply telling them the creditors in the global north, we are only paying 30% of our debt until you sit down with us to discuss the future, and particularly laying out their position in terms of transforming the international monetary system. And so,
Okay, Frans, I'll leave it at that and give Mr. Robbins some thought there on, debt strike at an international level, especially from third world countries.
I think if third world countries in fact got together, and they're in, again, everyone knows, terrible shape in terms of debt, most can never repay, what they owe. I think that would do it. I think they would very quickly, if they could do it collectively, they would get negotiations going. However, I would recommend you read an excellent book, came out 2 years ago by Jerome Roos, R-O-O-S, called Why Not Default? And he explains the system that has been developed internationally to prevent that, exactly that from happening. It involves cooptation of finance ministers in these countries. It involves penalties that would occur in terms of their banking system and so on and so forth. However, I think if they stuck to it, they might be able to accomplish it. But I agree completely, Frans. It's a good idea.
Got you. Let's go on with Joe. Joe Bongiovanni, unmute yourself. I'm sure we're going to talk about MMT here.
Well, yeah, I mean, to provide just a little bit of response, maybe a contrast, but see, the problem is that Tim's response to the critics of MMT have nothing to do with our criticism of MMT. We're on the AMI, annual conference. AMI has a critique of MMT, and it's not addressed at all by Tim, nor any of the others. But today, MMT is kind of flying high on the coattails of the pandemic, as Tim was indicating. But it's only in the public relations sense. Okay. Tim started out by explaining that, well, we've been able to come up with trillions of dollars to cover the cost of fighting the pandemic by the government. And, the way that they do that is kind of by some MMT magic, but here's the fact. Every penny and every dollar that was spent by the government during that period that was beyond taxation was borrowed. And the changes in the federal debt indicate exactly what I'm saying, okay? In 2019, just before the pandemic struck, at the end of it, we had $22.9 trillion in public debt. And at 2021, the same month, we have $29 trillion in public debt. So there wasn't any MMT magic at play that was bringing us the deliverance from the problems of the debts that are associated. So I just want to make that observation as only one critique of what you said. But the main thing is, well, you're not addressing the monetary reform critique at all. And I'm just going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Well, in defense of Tim, and that's one of my gripes with MMT, is that they indeed overlook the influence and the impact of the banking system. It's almost as if they they acknowledge the fact that banks create most of the money supply, but then they totally not engage what that impact might be. I've looked at their Mitchell and Watts and someone else book, their textbook. And it's just a, you know, little paragraph and that's it. And no thinking through what it means, you know. So I would say if you really want to have a good textbook about money creation, you know, go to Rossi's encyclopedia. But anyway, Tim, I'm defending you here. I'm sure you can do it yourself too.
I guess I'm unmuted. Yeah, no, I appreciate the comment, and as I kind of tried to suggest towards the end of the talk is that I've written on monetary reform before, and I'm far more radical in my views. If you read any of my work, I think why I engage, and this is why I said at the very beginning, it's a bit of a strange beast for me. Why I engage with MMT in this chapter that I've written for this book and in this talk, which is just a summary of it, is because it all of a sudden entered the mainstream press, and it started to get debated by people who would previously see this group as you know, a small little sect in universities somewhere, right? And like I said, Stephanie Kelton's book was published in June 2020, and all of a sudden we have this massive debate, and we have the empirical evidence that, you know, the government is actually spending trillions of dollars into the economy. Yes, it's done that before, but not on the level during the pandemic. And so I thought, well, this is interesting, even though I'm far more critical of MMT and obviously an advocate for monetary reform. I thought, okay, well, let's see what the critics are saying, see what the debate's about, and see if I can add to anything to this, right? And hopefully, arguably, you know, I have. I don't think anyone's done the empirical work that I've done. At least I've never seen it before. To suggest that, you know, we shouldn't be afraid of deficits. Should we go beyond that? Sure, there's no doubt about it. But I wanted to engage with that, and that was basically the purpose of this talk and this chapter. So criticism. But you know, be aware that my own work is far more critical of MMT.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So there was a Kevin that put something in the chat of a question. If he is there and wants to claim to pose it, go ahead. Kevin, are you there? You want to unmute yourself and post a question? If not, we go on to Jeff Eder, who is always ready to engage MMT stuff. Jeff, go ahead.
Hi, Tim. Yeah, no, I really liked your presentation because you use empirical data, which is something MMT never does almost. So, and another thing is it wasn't even really a critique of MMT. And what I noticed with any kind of mainstream critique of MMT, they don't ask the right questions. So there's basically two parts to MMT. And one is their descriptive analysis, which is totally fallacious. They get how government financing actually functions. They get it completely backwards. So I have actually done empirical research to establish that it doesn't work the way they say. The government does not spend first. All funds, in fact, in all of the G7 countries, all funds have to go through some kind of dedicated account with its central bank. So for example, in Canada, it's a consolidated revenue fund. In the United States, it's the Treasury's general account, and more specifically, the operating cash account, right? So you can look at the daily Treasury statement without doing a whole lot of research. You can look at it and say, oh, yeah, okay, there's deposits, there's withdrawals. Oh, the operating cash balance is always positive, which means that the only way that you could prove MMT, their stab hypothesis, is if you actually went back in time and you looked at you know, the historical record, and if somehow the government ever withdrawed funds when the operating cash balance was 0 or less, then you might have an argument for MMT stab hypothesis. So anyway, I just say you weren't critical enough of MMT. And again, you explained your position. You're more critical in your book. So,
all right. Thank you. So that was more of a comment. But if you want to extrapolate.
No, I take Jeff's point. I mean, again, I'm not going to be a defender for MMT. What I was just trying to show is some of the things that they suggest that, you know, on the extreme right of the spectrum, or let's say, I don't know, conservatives or anti-progressives, I don't know, whatever you want to label them. I'm just really sick of this kind of fear mongering that I've seen over the last little bit. And I think that's what I was trying to kind of show, that even though that we can go beyond MMT and I'm not a subscriber, that ultimately some of the things that they say, whether or not they get everything right, you know, some of the things that they suggest, particularly around deficit spending, we can say, yeah, we can get rid of this fear mongering about deficits being the primary cause of inflation. And so I guess that's one of the things I wanted to.
Can I say one more thing?
I hear you. Jeff, one more
Okay.
thing.
Okay, so what they say, yeah, they say some things that are true, but it's completely disconnected from their descriptive analysis.
There we go. Good statement. I think I had, is Don Richards next, or was it Paul LeBeau? Let's go to Don Richards first, then we'll go to the, unless Lucille is first there. First, Don Richards, go ahead.
It was actually the cow, Paul, who was before me, but because I've got the volume, I'll carry on. Thanks, Tim. This is Don Richards from Positive Money in New Zealand, just across the ditch from you guys. And listen, it was a good explanation. This isn't a critique or anything, but we have tried to engage with MMT over here. And the guy who was the head of MMT was a personal friend of mine. They refused to engage with us. We wanted to acknowledge the fact that there's no need for austerity measures, you know, and we had some form of commonality with some of what they were saying. They said, look, we're not going to engage with you. We've had reports that Positive Money in New Zealand or Positive Money UK has been critiquing us, and so we're not going to engage with you. So sometimes they can be their own worst enemy. It's just an observation. But in New Zealand, we don't have many people who are backing the horse that we are, and to actually have one of our potential allies say no is a bit disappointing.
Tim, little comments on that?
No, really. Thanks for that insight, Don. I mean, I think that's a real shame, right? And that's I think maybe testament to, I don't know if it's an individual, and then we can't branch the whole group, but almost to intellectual dishonesty, which is a real shame not to engage.
I hear you. Lucille, was it Paul or you?
Paul,
Paul LeBeau.
Hey, can you hear me?
Cow mask.
I can't. I'm on my cell phone here.
Okay,
So-
go ahead. We hear you.
we hear you.
So good. Yeah, I'm glad Joe and Jeff kind of covered some comments that I was going to make, and I've been in touch, had some very nice email conversations with Paul Shearer. I just sent him an article that came from the Fed about inflation, and he was very thankful. So I'm wondering, and by the way, I don't think you're defending MMT. I think you're defending a conclusion that MMT came to in terms of deficits don't matter right now. And that, I think, if you say now they don't matter, we have to spend regardless. I'll agree with that. My question in terms of inflation is the problem that when we say too much money chasing too few goods, or vice versa, that we're not really defining what the goods are, that we're just lumping the quantity of money and the potential places where money can be spent, but we're not taking into account the distribution of resources in the economy. In other words, it's not granular enough to just use that simple, saying that too much money is chasing too few goods. What do you think about that, Tim?
Yeah, go ahead. And I just put it in, Richard Werner has this idea of disaggregate, of course, the money that goes into GDP connected
Right.
activities and non-GDP connected activities. And if you take that into account, you get a whole different picture of what's happening inflation-wise.
Right.
Tim, go ahead.
Thanks for that. And I totally agree. I mean, inflation is its own field of study in a lot of ways. And obviously we know it as rising prices, but you're absolutely right to suggest that when you have adages like that, oh, there's too much money chasing too few goods. It doesn't ask what the goods or services are, right? And I think the most convincing thing that I read on inflation is from Jonathan Needson, who's a scholar at York University in my home of Canada. And he calls it differential inflation. That is to say, not all prices rise at the same time, at the same rate, at the same speed. And so I think you're absolutely right to suggest that you need to, we need to, if we're interested in inflation, need to actually look at the sources of inflation. And so I think what I was trying to do, and I think you're right, and I think you read what I was doing correctly, is just trying to be at least some, to have some sort of empirical way to understand, is MMT at least right on the deficit spending? Are deficits the real cause of inflation, which is what their critics really fear, right? You're going to spend too much money, we're going to have runaway inflation, and everything's going to go, to hell, right? And I thought, well, this can't be it, because we know that there are other things that create inflation, whether that's increasing oil prices, certain, supply chain shortages because of increasing shipping rates, whatever it might be. So I definitely take the point, and thank you for it.
Okay, Lucille, we'll end with you, and then we go to Howard. Lucille, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you very much. So I also, I appreciate both your work and appreciate the empirical effort, and it makes sense. Your just summary there as a contribution. I have to agree with my monetary reform colleagues here that I don't think you were critical enough of what they're missing and what reform is needed. The specific question that it comes from the end of your talk, Tim, and I would love to talk more about the debt strike of Richard's and both of yours. But my question, you seem to say at the end that what we pay labor is insufficient for there to be enough purchasing power among the people, among the workers, among laborers, to buy or pay for what's produced. It seemed to be that's what you were saying. And if you could address, well, what is the connection between that conclusion, if you were drawing that, and the money system and monetary critique and reform? Because, a simplistic response is, well, damn it, just pay workers more. And that's not what's going on, but that's not really enough of the answer, because the answer is more systemic. So can you make the connection of the money system, its critique and reform of it to address that point? Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Lucille. Let me see if I can make that connection. Again, this is really going back to the work of C.H. Douglas. He was actually an engineer. He wasn't an economist. He wasn't a financier, wasn't a mathematician. And he was helping to build the London Tube. And so he was underground. He was designing parts of the tube system in the UK. And all of a sudden, his bosses came to him and said, well, we don't have any money to keep this up, right? And he looked around. He's like, well, we've got the laborers. We've got the know-how of how to build the tube. We've got the material. The only thing we don't have is money. And so C.H. Douglas kind of started this quest to be like, well, where does money come from anyway? How does the money system expand, and so on and so forth? So he started looking into the accounting of capitalism. And as I tried to suggest earlier, it's a cost plus system. So in this system, you are always going to have a dearth of money. That is to say, purchasing power for the goods and services produced. So let me tie that to what you said earlier. Well, maybe the problem is we need to increase wages. Well, if you increase wages, then you're just going to increase prices, because wages are a cost to the capitalist firm. I'm not saying we shouldn't increase wages. Maybe there is an argument for that, right? but that will lead to increasing prices in various goods and services. So what C.H. Douglas proposed was that the government gives citizens a dividend, right? So it doesn't enter the costs of businesses. So one way to increase purchasing power, pay workers more wages or salaries, right? That increases costs. What C.H. Douglas was suggesting is give a societal dividend to man, woman, and child or household, and you can do it in various ways, every year, or maybe it's paid fortnightly or monthly or whatever, a certain stipend. So it's not quite a universal basic income that he was proposing, but something akin to that, right? And so that would bolster people's spending and force them, or actually say force, or allow them to not go into personal debt with a bank and say a credit card or whatever to spend over and above what they actually make in a way. So I hope that makes sense, right? So there's two ways to do it, to give more purchasing power to people. Either the government's going to do that as basically a stipend, a gift, but based on the productivity of society, or you increase wages, fight for increase in wages, but that's just going to increase prices.
But if you don't change the money system, then how is government going to do that? The government is going to issue new bonds to, I mean, you're not getting to the monetary critique and reform yet. You're just saying we give workers more peanuts to buy crap, and that's the answer.
Lucille, you're absolutely right, and believe me, like behind this, there's a whole environmental and ecological critique, right? Like, so it's one thing to notice the mathematical certainty that there's not enough purchasing power for the goods and services we produce. It's quite another, kettle of fish to be like, well, what are we buying, and are we producing things that are useful? And you think of all the plastic and everything, right? So I completely get the environmental and ecological critique, which I've not even touched upon here, but have elsewhere. So that's another deep question. As far as monetary reform, again, I've written a little bit about this before, but nonetheless, the idea of societal dividend, or what Douglas actually called social credit, which now has connotations with Chinese social credit, which the two are not the same at all, but it's not good to mix the two up. Basically, if we were to say with the current system, then that would be something. So you're absolutely right, Lucille, to suggest that it would be a reform, but it wouldn't be a reform of the monetary system, which I completely advocate in various ways, but I have not argued or went into detail here. So I appreciate the point, and thank you very much.
Yeah, just make sure the chapter you're writing, you get to it at the end of it.
I will, Lucille, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, we'll get one last expert in, Mark Pesch, and then really we'll get to Howard. Mark, keep it sweet and short.
It's just sweet and short. That's my whole topic tomorrow, and I'll cover all the solutions and the things, but you do need monetary reform to do it. So it is the reason for monetary reform. So I'll discuss all the solutions tomorrow.
Okay.
That's it.
Got it.
Okay.
On that good note, I propose that we close this session. Tim, thank you so much for your work, for your writing, enormous productivity. It's kind of hard to keep up for a regular citizen of what you're doing. But the power as debt, the debt as power, sorry, book. I think that's a really nice entry book from where you can, let's say, graduate to Sovereign Money by Joseph Huber, which makes me think, like, if we ever, compose a class on monetary reform, what text to use and how to build up the understanding. But that's a whole different piece that we can work at. So Tim, thank you so much for getting up and getting high maybe on coffee and get us, on this MMT thing, which is kind of, bugging a lot of us, and you gave us some extra tools to deal with it.
If this video is helpful, please hit the like button, Subscribe for new video notifications. Please consider donating at monetary.org/donate. Don't forget to check us out on Twitter at AMI Monetary or on our website